So motivating democracy reform. You're the captain of the Titanic, you've hit the iceberg. You go out, you see the overturned tables, and you think to yourself, we can fix this. And then your crew comes to you and informs you that there's a gash in the side of the hull. And you realize, even if you fix it, it doesn't matter, the ship is going down. And then you need to convince people to climb into lifeboats, which in the middle of the Atlantic, in the middle of the night, in the middle of, in the middle of the winter, is a hard thing to do when you're on the Titanic, because everyone's convinced this is the unsinkable and the lifeboat seems so uncertain. I want to suggest this is a kind of perfect parallel to where we are in democracy reform today. We've hit an iceberg, we have a broken democracy. There are turntables in this democracy, in the sense of things that are broken about the democracy that we could imagine could be fixed, could be righted. But there's also a gashed hull. That's not to say we shouldn't try to right the things that could be fixed. It's just to say that even if we do, it's not going to matter, because democracy in the current environment is not going to function. And so the aim now is to think about what the lifeboats for this democracy might look like. Okay, so let's start with the turned tables. I'm going to collapse a whole bunch of argument into something relatively simple, because I'm sure most of this is familiar. You can think about the dimensions of the institutions of modern American democracy and recognize how at least these dimensions defeat the objective of representative democracy in the sense of majoritarian representative democracy. So we understand the way states deploy techniques to suppress the votes, in particular the votes of the party not in power. That manifests itself dramatically in the context of Republican states suppressing Democratic votes that, of course, are most easily suppressed in racially distinct districts. But that's one part of the dynamic that produces relatively unrepresentative. It produces unrepresentativeness in that context. Gerrymandering is the second dimension, where districts are drawn for the purpose of protecting incumbents or the party in power, minimizing the number of so-called swing seats in any election. They're again defeating the objectives of representativeness by amplifying the power of the extremes in either party. Because in safe seats, the only candidate you are fearful of is an even more extreme member of your own party. You'll never be defeated by the other party. You're likely to be defeated by a more extreme member of your party, because extreme members are more likely to show up to vote than the moderate. The corrupting influence of money in politics concentrates enormous power in a tiny, tiny few, thereby defeating the representativeness of the system. Partisan primaries have the same dynamic of amplifying the significance or salience of extreme members of a district, because they're the ones that typically show up to those primaries. And finally, the filibuster in the United States Senate, which I think is an underappreciated destructive dynamic, mainly because it seems like it's of such ancient pedigree. But what we have to recognize about the filibuster is not that the device is new, but the deployment or the norms around its deployment are new. So since Obama became president and Mitch McConnell decided to use the full force of the Senate to stop him from achieving a second term, we've moved from a system which took the exception, where people had a significant commitment to some issue and they decided to filibuster it, and turned it into the norm, so that everything except budget reconciliations and some nominations are now subject to a filibuster. And the effect of that is enormously minoritarian. Because if you recognize that it takes 60 votes to overcome a filibuster, that means 41 votes can stop any legislation from going through the Senate, meaning going through Congress. If you take the smallest 21 states that supported Donald Trump by at least 10 points in 2016, that's 42 votes. Those states would represent 21% of the American population. So it's a system structured to allow this very small minority to basically veto the capacity of any legislation to pass through Congress. These are the overturned tables of modern American democracy. the dimensions of representative failure. And these, each of them is fixable. So the first three would have been fixed, mainly fixed, if HR 1 had become the law. But if the Democrats regain control in a trifecta someday, then it will be HR 1, and these three will be significantly improved. And eventually the money in politics one could also be affected. Final five voting is just spreading across the country at the state level as a way to deal with the problem caused by partisan primaries. And there's a big move, at least in both parties are coming to this point, but big move to abolish the default of automatic filibuster. Probably will settle on a filibuster where you can filibuster if you're willing to stand up and do the work, which would radically change the effect of the filibuster. So the point is, each of these things is fixable if we could find the political will to fix them. And in that sense, I want to say they are like the turntables on the Titanic. Okay. But then what is the gashed hull? So here I want to use a word in a different way from how we're ordinarily going to think about it. I'm going to say the gashed hull is artificial intelligence. But by artificial intelligence, I mean to recognize, if we understand there's a category of intelligence, we suggest there's artificial and natural. We presume to be at the top of the order of natural intelligence, but we have constructed institutions of artificial intelligence. This is intelligence that we make, and we have already made these institutions of intelligence. I'm going to call some of them analog AI, or AAI. These are institutions that act instrumentally, and they deploy an instrumental rationality in their acting based on facts in the world. So, for example, democracy is an artificial intelligence. It's an institution, it has elections, parliaments, constitutions for the purpose of some collective end. The United States, we declare this at the beginning of the Constitution as our collective end. So a democracy is an analog artificial intelligence devoted to a common good. Or we could think of corporations as artificial intelligence. They're institutions, they have boards, management, finance for the purpose of making money, at least as viewed today, as Friedman defined it or distorted it. The only corporate social responsibility a company has is to maximize its profits. That's the modern and observed view of what a corporation is supposed to do, but it is what it is. And so we can understand the corporation as an analog artificial intelligence devoted to maximizing shareholder value in the modern framing of that. Okay, these AIs can compete, and the purposes of them can compete. So imagine a corporation sitting next to a park, polluting the park, democratic referendum to clean up the pollution. Imagine the referendum passes and the park is cleaned up. We would celebrate that as AI is competing, but the democracy AI winning in that competition. It's a happy story. It's also increasingly a fantasy. Because today the corporations are the stronger AI in our modern democracy. Indeed, if we think about two axes of instrumental rationality across time, if we think of humans as the first instrumentally rational entities here, and then analog AIs standing on top of them, democracy and corporations, each of these layers aspires to control the higher layer. So humans aspire to control democracy through elections. Democracies aspire to control corporations through regulations. But the reality of control is a little different. Corporations increasingly exercise dominant control over the democracy. Super PAC spending is one clear, yes?
Just clarification, the axis of time means like historically?
Yeah.
So that we started on the units and then developed.
Yeah. So super PAC spending is the way corporations leverage control over democracy. And democracy can actually leverage its control over humans. So here's Wisconsin, the state which is basically purple. Like Biden barely won Wisconsin in 2020. But because of gerrymandering, 65% of the districts are Republican and 35% are Democrat. So a state that's basically purple is supermajority Republican because of gerrymandering. And in that sense, then the democracy itself limits the ability of humans to control the democracy according to democratic principles. So I've defined these as analog AIs, and we can think of digital AIs as presenting an important difference. They're going to be massively more efficient in achieving their instrumentally rational ends. So I'm not sure how to represent the scale of massively more efficient, but the digital AIs, of course, are already here now. Tristan Harris refers to as the first contact, which was social media and its interaction with democracy. Platforms like these, Tristan was an engineer at Google who left to start the Center for Humane Technology. He's been preaching the science of attention, which he reports Silicon Valley to be quite focused on. Silicon Valley learning how to engineer attention to overcome the natural resistance that humans would have to these technologies to increase engagement with the platforms. It's a kind of brain hacking to leverage our natural features of the brain to get them to engage more. This brain hacking exploits features of our evolution. So we are naturally drawn to random rewards. So the platforms embed random reward structures to drive our attention. We can't resist bottomless pits. So they give us bottomless pits to drive our attention. All of this with the aim to increase engagement in order to sell more ads. That's its objective function. The difference between brain hacking and the ordinary hacking of humans is just the orders of magnitude more powerful when you can leverage the control over the brain. Digital AI is going to be more powerful in this sense than analog AI, driven by a business model, or in AI speak, an objective function, the end that we are maximizing towards. It aims to achieve that end regardless of the externalities that it's imposing on the rest of us. So here again, we have the aspiration of control. Corporations, through management, believe they're controlling their AI. Been wonderful examples of the failure of that control. So in 2017, Facebook was revealed by ProPublica to be offering a category in their advertising platform to reach Jew haters, quote unquote, Jew haters. And when this was revealed, Facebook correctly said, nobody in Facebook ever wrote the category Jew hater. The AI had developed the category Jew hater by watching people on Facebook and determining this would be an efficient way to sell ads because it could identify people understood to be Jew haters. A suggestion of just how quickly the machine can get ahead of the entities that are trying to control the machine, namely the corporations, which is the sense in which the reality of control is less than the aspiration. But even more fundamentally, I had the honor of representing Frances Haugen when she first came out as the Facebook whistleblower. If you look through the Facebook files, the Facebook files are filled with examples of engineers talking about how to engineer the platform to make it safe for democracy, recognizing the harm not just to democracy, but also to humans, especially young women. But again and again, the objective function of maximizing engagement, to maximize growth, to maximize stock valuation, overrode the safety objectives of those engineers. And so this is to suggest when the corporation and AI share an objective function, so corporations trying to maximize engagement, the AI trying to maximize engagement, the objective functions here, the AI is going to win. Okay, that was first contact. Tristan's now just talking about how we should understand a second kind of contact that the new LLM AI will bring to this. AI will be much more powerful, not just in targeting content the way it was really good with social media, identifying what you were likely to want and to drive you down the rabbit hole to maximize your engagement, but genuinely creating content, targeting in its creation, content most likely, or it's learned from you most likely to get you involved. Did a thought paper recently about technology we called Clogger. And you could think of Clogger as an automatic campaign, trained on the objective function to win, obviously, to maximize the chance of victory. Techniques some of them would be perfectly fine. It would produce content like targeted messages or personalized messages, interest-focused articles. Some would certainly not be fine. Hate messages, if it works, it will be deployed. Disinformation, if it works, it becomes a technique. This terrifying paper was just begun to be surveyed, where they describe, this paper argues that a range of current AI systems, one that are out there right now, have learned how to deceive humans. Now, what's not being said here is that the AI systems were trained to deceive humans. What this is saying is they developed the technique to deceive humans as a way of achieving the objective that they were assigned to achieve. So they've learned this behavior as, just one efficient way to achieve whatever they're trying to do. So whatever it takes in order to win, this clogger AI gets deployed. So the point is to think about AI in the context of political campaigns and understand that what this means is that we've evolved a media that profits from rendering us polarized and ignorant, because polarized and ignorant is a technique to get us engaged and more engaged on the platform, but produces us living in these bubbles. But it's not just that we live in bubbles, it's that the negative partisanship means we live in them with scorn for the other side. Barack Obama describes how if you read Fox News, you're in one reality, you read New York Times, you live in a different reality. And I think we need to just recognize how astonishingly present this fact is in our current political environment. So whatever you think of Joe Biden, I think it's hard not to agree that he is the most consequential president since Lyndon Baines Johnson, has achieved the most of any president since Lyndon Baines Johnson. But this is his approval rating relative to Donald Trump's. He is just as approved of, even though the most consequential president we've seen in many generations' lifetimes, relative to Donald Trump. Or think about January 6th. After January 6th, the Washington Post did this poll, found that 70% said they agreed with Trump's contention that he received more votes than Biden. Many people think, well, that would just be the uneducated, but even a majority of Republicans with college degrees said they believe the election results were fraudulent. Okay, but you might look at that and think, okay, that's January 6, 2021. People eventually learn the truth, just give them time, settle down a little bit. But in fact, the number is the same. We've made no progress in convincing people that indeed the election was not stolen. The same people believe it as believed it before, despite the fact we've had 2 years of constant coverage of the fact that there is no evidence to suggest that there's enough underlying that. This is actually, for me, the most troubling. This is just released poll. Looking at the different parties and whether people trust the party to do which party for each of these things. Some of them are not surprising. So dealing with border security, Republicans are perceived to be better than that than Democrats. Here's the one that's astonishing. Protecting democracy. The public thinks Republicans are more likely to protect Democratic press for the last 2 years has been the story about how there was a concerted conspiracy and campaign to defeat the results of an election. And yet the consequence of this polarized bubble media environment is that we can have a very strong conflicting views, conflicting with what we might think of as a core view of reality. Okay, so thinking about first and second contact together, what I think this means is that democracy itself has been hacked by the environment within which it currently lives. It's almost as if like an ozone layer opened up and radiation bleeds down on us, and now we've got to move underground because we realize we can't survive in that environment anymore. I think that's the intuition we have to have about democracy. It's been hacked by these intelligences, both artificial and digital, both foreign and domestic. So the domestic ones, like Facebook, hack it for profit reasons. Mark Zuckerberg doesn't hate America, he just loves making money. But there are foreign hackers too. Taiwan is just now beginning to see what China is capable of in interfering with their election. And that's a precursor to the same strategy being deployed in the United States in 2024. And the point to see is that these artificial intelligences have better instrumental rationality than democracy does in defending itself. So it's in this sense, I want to say, that we could fix democracy, but there is this gashed hull that means fixing it itself, it won't be enough. And that what this means is, well, it's a technical legal term, but what this means is that we need to think about how to restructure democracy to protect it from this threat. Okay, so move it underground or move it into a place where it is not vulnerable in that way. And that's where we begin to think about what lifeboats from this kind of democracy look like. And that begins by just asking, are there places where we imagine we do democracy well? And I think the answer to that is yes, we do democracy well. We're pretty good collectively. When we do democracy slowly, like when we slow the process down to kind of human speed, and in a way that makes it so we can engage in the way we imagine people would engage with democracy. There's a slow food movement that deals with the horrors caused by the processed food industry, which basically says if you just cook your own food and eat with friends, you will be healthy because the food you cook can't be as poisonous as the processed food. You just don't have the chemicals in your house. And if you eat it slowly, that's at a pace your body can deal with. The same intuition applies here with democracy. Slow democracy down. So that when people are engaging on democratic questions, they're doing it at a pace where they can begin to engage and understand the other side. And do it in contexts which are representative, informed, and deliberated, meaning where people have an opportunity to engage about the question and understand the other side and come to their own view in the face of that. So we're beginning to see this around the world in the context of the emergence of citizen assemblies. Americans would more likely want to call it citizen juries. Either way, these are random representative bodies, some more representative than others, just simply because of their size, structured to be face-to-face, informed. People are given information in advance to help them understand the issue they're going to deliberate on, and then they deliberate about these particular issues. So Iceland did an early version of this to stand up what you think of as a crowdsourced constitution. But the first process was a random selection of all of Iceland that sat down and identified the values that the constitution needs to respect. And then there was an election for basically a committee that was draw up the constitution, a committee of like 35, I think. 500 people in Iceland ran for that. They had a ranked choice system for picking out which were the winners. They drafted their constitution. The people in referendum approved it by 2/3, and then the parliament just said, no, we're not having to do with it. But the point is, it was a process that built on this citizen assembly-like idea. Ireland, most famously now, is deploying these to real consequence. There's a whole series, but the two most interesting were citizen assemblies around abortion rights and gay marriage. Two issues that we know the Irish parliament could never have addressed in a way that would be supportive of abortion rights or supportive of gay marriage. The Citizens Assembly, which was 100 citizens, deliberated on it. More than 60% of the assembly supported liberalizing abortion regulation and gay rights and right to marry. And then it sent out to referendum, and the referendum numbers were even higher. So it was a way to bypass what was clearly a political process that would never have been able to yield the conclusion that was in fact the conclusion that the public supported. I think the coolest example of this, I actually saw here. This is in Mongolia. That's actually a picture, not a painting. This is a picture of Mongolia in the sense that John Adams would have talked about a legislature. It is a random selection of Mongolians. Mongolian government basically sent out a letter to 800 citizens. 750 showed up and told them, you need to come to Ulaanbaatar and you're going to deliberate about amendments to the Constitution. Now, they did this because the Constitution has a provision that says before any amendment can be considered, it has to be passed through a deliberative poll. So perfectly representative sample, a little bit too many women, but that's probably not a problem. Show up to Ulaanbaatar, that's the Parliament building. They then spent 4 days deliberating in large groups about these proposed amendments, and then also in small groups about these proposed amendments. And at the end, they gave their views, and the difference between their views going in, views coming out, informed what the legislature then did with the amendments and changed fundamentally which amendments were going to be considered. Okay, now I suggest that these examples teach us that there is a way to move democracy inside, in the sense of move it into a place that is not vulnerable in the way ordinary democracy is to these outside influences, protected from the consequence of AI. And that's the lifeboat example. And here's a particular example teed up in that paper that I just want to make sure we have enough on the table to talk about. So you know the Constitution in Article 5 has 2 ways to amend the Constitution, and one is the unused convention process. Congress can propose an amendment if 2/3 propose it, but if 2/3 of the states call for a convention, then Congress has to convene a convention. It's only ever been Congress that has had proposed amendments. We've never had a convention. And you might say, well, why have we never had a convention? And I think the basic answer is FUD, fear, uncertainty, and distrust, on both sides. So in the 1960s, it was the right-wing John Birch Society that said an Article 5 convention would turn us into a Stalinist nation. Phyllis Schlafly was the most virulent opponent of the convention. Today, it's basically Common Cause and liberals who are terrified about the idea of a convention. My friend Bob Reich is one of the most vocal opponents of a convention. I didn't think about this issue.
The biggest threat to our democracy that nobody's talking about is the real possibility of a rogue constitutional convention, empowering extremists to radically reshape the Constitution, our laws, and our country. If just a few more states sign on to what's called an Article 5 convention for a balanced budget amendment, there's no limit to the damage they might do. But let me explain. There are 2 ways to amend the United States Constitution. One way, the way we've passed every amendment since the Bill of Rights, is for 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate to vote for a proposed amendment and then have it ratified by at least 3/4 of the states, now 38 in number. But there's a second way to amend the Constitution. 2/3 of the states may demand Congress form a constitutional convention to propose amendments. Once a constitutional convention is convened, there are no rules to limit or constrain what comes next. Amendments proposed by an Article 5 convention are supposed to be ratified by 38 states, but convention delegates could hijack the process and change the ratification process itself, tossing out the 38 state requirement. A balanced budget amendment would be crazy enough, but nothing would be safe. A woman's right to choose, marriage equality, First Amendment protections for free speech and free press, equal protection of the laws, checks and balances. The worst case scenario is an Article 5 convention would allow delegates to write their agenda into our Constitution. This would be chaos. Already, 28 states have called for a constitutional convention. They only need 6 more to succeed. Unlimited money in politics and partisan gerrymandering have already given Republicans control of a majority of state legislatures. Big money interests like the Koch brothers and ALEC are investing heavily in the push for a constitutional convention, which means that they'd be calling the shots if one takes place. Now, I understand you're probably already overwhelmed with political actions you need to take.
Yeah, we are. Okay. Of all the, so there's a bunch in that that's just flat out false. Like, for example, there is no way that an Article 5 convention could change the rules for ratification. We can debate that, but let's put that to one side. I think the real anxiety that has been complained of with American constitutional amendment processes from the beginning is that there's no built-in democratic check. Unlike most modern democracies that have ratification systems for amendments, we have no referendum, we have no necessary reason, one way for the people to actually step in. And what I realized as I was thinking about this particular problem that I think is the strongest complaint that Reich and others have about the convention is that there was a way to build a democratic check into the convention process. And step one of this way is to recognize, so step one starts by, first of all, recognizing exactly how close we are to a convention. So Reich said, I mean, here's the actual number right now, 27 have called for a balanced budget convention, and 4 have unrepealed plenary calls, which means we're at 31 and 34 would be needed to call a convention. So we're close. And I would say, having watched very closely the amount of money that's in the pro-convention movement right now, it's about $1 billion in the bank, we will have a convention. And that's, of course, what's terrifying to people because the fear is there's no way to control, no legal check on what the convention would do. And this is what Reich was saying when he was saying that the convention could run away. What I realized is I actually personally fixed this. So by losing a Supreme Court case, I fixed this problem. So I took a case to the Supreme Court, raising the question, we're trying to resolve the question because it was in many people's mind an open question of whether the vote of presidential electors in the Electoral College could be controlled by law. In 2016, there were a bunch of electors who tried to persuade Republican electors to effectively vote so that it would throw the election into the House and maybe Trump would be elected, but maybe another Republican would be elected instead. And so the question was whether they could do that. And most people looking at the history of this thought, of course, they could do that. Obviously not. The states obviously had no power to control how an elector could vote. You know, the only other time the Constitution uses the word elector is to refer to voters. Could the state of Massachusetts pass a law that says all voters must vote Democratic? You know, obviously that's inherent in the idea of a voter or an elector is the ability to choose. So I thought it was obvious, but the Supreme Court 9-0 said, obviously, yes, you can legally bind the electors to vote one way or the other. And more interestingly, you can set up a structure so that if they vote the wrong way, they are automatically expelled and a new elector is appointed to vote in the right way. Okay, so the silver lining in this decision, it seems to me, is this case means you could control delegates in an Article 5 convention too. Presidential electors are controllable, an office expressly articulated in the Constitution. Then delegates to a convention, not in the Constitution, should also be controllable as well. And so what this means is, imagine a state like Massachusetts passed a law that said, first, we're going to convene a citizen assembly, citizen jury. It'll be random representative. Let's say it's large and mandatory, like a regular jury. The jury then sits and reviews amendment proposals that are sort of, you know, the plausible proposals that are out there. And it deliberates on whether to approve them or not. And then the law setting up this assembly says no delegate to an Article 5 convention can support any amendment unless 60% of the citizen assembly has approved of it. So that means their vote is constrained by this law. And in this sense, we've solved the first problem with the Article 5 convention because the convention itself is now controllable through law tied to a democratic check, indeed a democratic check that is better in a rich sense of democracy than maybe any democratic check that we have within our system right now, legally controllable. Okay, now then you could say, well, that's just one state. And so why is that going to matter if one state does it like this? That leads to step 2. If it takes 38 states to ratify an amendment, then 13 states can stop any amendment. So imagine 13 states say, we, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, preemptively reject any amendment proposed by the vote of delegates who are not democratically accountable. Now, nobody knows whether a preemptive rejection has any force, but it's a lot to risk if you're going to stand up a convention. That if you stand up the convention, then 13 states have already preemptively rejected any amendment that comes out of the convention. So that means there would be no reason for the amendment to come out because it would be dead, stillborn. And democratic accountability could mean either referendums or citizen assemblies. You just have to build some democratic accountability into your process for selecting these representatives, these delegates. And so this is a structure to leverage the minority veto of 13 states who get to veto any amendment to produce a democratically constrained convention, a majoritarian constrained convention. And so bingo on the second dimension too. We could think of this as a safe convention, democratically safe convention, using citizen assemblies to constrain that process and getting us an amendable constitution tied to democratic values, unlike anything we've seen in the Constitution before. So in this, I want to suggest this is an example of a lifeboat. It's a way of taking a process which right now is vulnerable to be hacked in all sorts of ways, especially given the character of our media today, and placing it in a space where it's less likely to be hacked, yet expressing democratic values in a more effective way. And if deployed consistently across the country, could get us an attitude towards a constitution that would make the Constitution once again amendable, which it is today basically unamendable. Okay, that's a lot. Stop at that. Happy to.
Can you say one more time slowly exactly what that amendment would, what the decision would be on the part of Massachusetts and 12 like-minded states?
Yeah. So Massachusetts has a law that says first convene a citizen assembly. That assembly reviews all viable amendments that are out there. You know, so the balanced budget amendments, the anti-Citizens United amendment, whatever. And then it gives its view after deliberating, and it says, you know, 60% of the convention approves the anti-Citizens United amendment, 50% support the balanced budget amendment. And the law says, if you are a delegate from Massachusetts in this convention, you can't vote for any amendment that has not received at least 60% support. So you've constrained the vote of your delegates. And then the second part of the law says, and the state of Commonwealth of Massachusetts preemptively rejects any amendment that has been considered by delegates who are not democratically accountable. So the ideal democratic accountability would be convention, but it doesn't have to be just the convention. It could be democratic accountability through referenda or something like that. A referenda says 60% support something. But the point is, either way, what you've done is you've said, we consider dead any amendment that hasn't come through a democratically accountable convention process, which creates the incentive to produce a democratically.
So basically those 13 would say to the other 37, if you just send delegates who are free to do what they want,
You're dead.
will automatically vote against anything.
We have already.
Yeah.
We preemptively reject.
Right. So basically the 13 are forcing a certain democratic procedure on the 37. That is a very interesting idea.
That's the dynamic. Yeah.
But could this system move the problem slightly only? What I mean is, if right now we are trying not to leave a democratic decision, such as the reform of the Constitution, to people or corporations or entities that are not democratically accountable, if we want to create these laws, then these laws will have to be passed by the state of Massachusetts. So then the corporations or whoever does not want that to be passed simply has to act on the
So great question. So there's a certain political reality that has to obtain before this is feasible. Number one, blue states have got to become convinced that there is going to be a convention. Right now, people are not thinking about it. They're not doing the numbers. They're not recognizing the extraordinary amount of resources that are out there to produce a convention. But when we get close to seeing that there is going to be a convention, then the question is what to do about it. One thing to do about it is just to shut it down by saying we preemptively reject whatever comes out of the convention. and maybe that's strategically the right thing to do, but what I'm saying is there's an opportunity to do something even better, which would be to say, we're going to create a constraint to produce a certain kind of convention. Now, I've spent a lot of time dealing with especially people on the right who are pushing for a convention. They actually don't think that their issues are right-wing issues. They think that they're cross-partisan issues. So they're not really worried about something like this. They think that ordinary people would support their issues anyway. But my sense is that if there is going to be a convention, it will be perceived as a crisis, democratic crisis. And this is a way to diffuse the crisis and produce something which is a better mechanism for amending the Constitution than the one we have right now. Even the one we have in Congress right now. I mean, Congress is never going to propose an amendment because of the partisan character of Congress right now. It takes 2/3 to propose an amendment. It's just not going to happen for anything interesting. And so that means we have an unamendable Constitution, which is why you see such innovation by courts, by the Supreme Court, kind of responding to the unamendability of the American Constitution. We'll amend it through judicial decree. And that obviously in the long term is not a stable solution for a court.
Just a short question of definition. Like a convention is by definition a citizen assembly or jury.
Yeah. Well, let's separate two ideas. So, because it's a really important jurisprudential point. In our tradition, we have always understood that there's a power called a convention. Kind of the people outdoors, this is kind of it's extraordinary government. When the Constitution was first drafted, there was a debate about how we would get around the Articles of Confederation. This is what Bob Reich is talking about when he says they would have the ability to change the rules of adoption. The Articles of Confederation said, you can't amend the Articles of Confederation unless you have a unanimous vote of the state legislatures. And the drafters of the Constitution realized there was no way they were going to have a unanimous vote. And they knew they couldn't trust the state legislatures. So when they convened the convention in Philadelphia to draft the Constitution, they proposed that Congress change the rules and change the rules to say, if 9 states adopt it, and not 9 state legislatures, but 9 state conventions, it will be considered adopted. So there's a big debate about what's the authority for doing that. And the answer was, it's a kind of almost Hobbesian sense of, we always have the right to alter or abolish our Constitution, and the mechanism of doing it is basically a majoritarian mechanism. And so that's what we invoke to throw away the old Constitution and adopt something new. The convention that I'm talking about is not part of that process. I think that process exists and remains open to us. But the convention I'm talking about is a procedure described in the Constitution for establishing a body that has one power, the power to propose amendments. So Bob Reich would say, okay, but let's say it proposes that any amendment it proposes gets to be ratified by a referendum. But to keep the parallel precise, you would have to say, okay, imagine a modern Congress proposed an amendment to abolish imagine a convention proposed an amendment to abolish the Second Amendment, realized that would never pass in the ordinary way. So it said, and we think this should be ratified if a majority of Americans vote for it. To be precise, you would have to say they would send that back to Congress, and Congress would then declare, if a majority of Americans vote for this amendment, it's now law. Well, nobody could believe that if Congress did that, the Supreme Court would just sit back and say, okay, that's fine. I mean, obviously, the Supreme Court would step in and stop them from doing that, because the plain text of the Constitution says the only thing the convention can do is propose an amendment. And the amendment, you could propose to change the rules for ratification, but you only change them if you ratify them. So it's an internal convention, not a constitutional convention. It's why, to be precise, we should call it an Article 5 convention, not a constitutional convention. And it exists and functions because of the Constitution. Citizen assemblies, I'm saying we're creating as kind of adjacent institutions that are filtering what delegates from a particular state are allowed to support. And so it's saying, of all the amendments, you can support the following 4. So when they meet and they say, are we going to send an amendment out to the states to be ratified? The delegates are constrained about which amendments they're allowed to vote for.
Yeah, I guess my question is, I think particularly this majority on the Supreme Court is not able to reinterpret their own precedent when it's convenient to them. So I guess the question is, kind of what makes you so confident that this is worth, going through, and that they would kind of respect this precedent of the legally bounding, electors in this other context. It seems like, the kind of critique of, this is, you're playing with fire and you're saying, no, it's okay, we have this, like thing in place, but, that still relies on the Supreme Court applying their previous precedent, in the same way. And I don't know if I share the same, faith in the current majority.
Well, I mean, if you're worried that the court would just flip its principle, the blackmail device, the one that says nothing coming out of a convention that doesn't have democratic accountability, could have a contingency built in. It says, but if the Supreme Court rejects democratic accountability in the amendment process, we just reject everything. We just flat out reject everything. So again, 13 states are able to basically say there will be no amendment through the convention process. Or another way to put it is, the only way we accept a convention process is if it's democratically accountable, and that will require both the legislatures building democratic accountability in and the courts allowing it. And those two conditions, if they obtain, it seems to be produce a better process for amending. And if they don't, then we can just say nothing.
I have two questions. The first is this assuming that these states pass this legislation in response to a convention that has been called, 13 states call special sessions of their legislatures to then set these specifications as to how an elector votes. I'm skeptical that like so much that requires organization, right? Like 13 different sponsors in 13 different states coordinating their legislation while still responding to like a convention that's been called. Is this like a movement that needs to take place now?
I think this, it's certainly a movement that requires beginning to educate legislatures. So I just did that to the Massachusetts legislature last week. And of course, they have no understanding at all about what's going on with this. They have no understanding that a convention is even happening. But the point is that if a convention is called, Congress will tell the state legislatures they need to decide how their delegates are selected. So there is a mandatory process in all of the states. And what I'm imagining is when that is happening, you have a faction, the blue state faction, that says, we're not going to have a right-wing amendment to the Constitution. How do we avoid it? And it could be the most likely thing they do is just preemptively say, we reject everything. But the more hopeful thing they do is begin to convince them that we could actually build a better amendment system without amending the Constitution in some sense. We could just do it. And we should celebrate that because it would be, what would come out of that process is something that would be much more edifying of democracy than anything that comes out of legislature. So George Gallup famously said, he invented the random representative polling, that he would bind himself, he would willingly bind himself to the decisions of the majority as expressed in his polls, which of course is an insane thing to do. But I would willingly bind myself to the decisions of random representative citizens inside of an assembly, absolutely. Have you guys, do you know the book Against Elections by Van Reybrouck? Okay, this is a fantastic book. So he's Belgian. And the premise of the book is, look, we've had 3,000, 4,000 years of democracy. Only 200 of those years have had elections. And when the elections were born, Montesquieu and Aristotle both basically said, if you're going to have a democracy and you pick by lot, that will tend towards democratic systems. If you pick through elections, it will tend towards aristocratic systems. The Americans embraced elections nonetheless, rather than sortition systems, because they imagined a kind of aristocracy of talent rising to the top. You know, of all the things to convince Americans that our framers were mistaken about, convincing them that indeed the system does not inspire the most talented to join government is the easiest, because, you know, obviously today the most visible are the most clownish. But the point about bringing this in is just to recognize that there is actually a long, rich history, not just in Athens, but not just in Greece, but in Italy, in Florence and Venice, hundreds of years of running government through sortition structures. And I think, you know, if you then tie that to recognize that in our own constitution, there is an essential sortition structure built in. Like, you know, you can't be convicted by the federal government of any crime unless we first give you up through a grand jury, and then we convict you in a petit jury. So we, as expressed in these sortition devices, grand jury and petit jury, have the ultimate control about whether you're going to be convicted of a crime. That's embedding constitutionally a sortition structure, a really bad one. You know, it's not large enough. It's not, lawyers are allowed to muck it up by their preemptive strikes of members of juries, but at least it's a commitment to the idea. And what this is saying is we begin to build out that conception and begin to hive off certain things into those places, we might be able to tame the worst of what democracy stuff is doing.
Alex, you had a question.
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Awesome. I'm a little sick, so pardon my voice, but I had a question about if your vision of these conventions were to succeed, basically how would the Republican Party respond? So basically we would likely see big gains and large strides in issues that have widespread support, like campaign finance reform, healthcare, all those types of economic issues. But today, in my opinion, one of the central projects of the Republican Party is to divide people on social issues to try to sort of mitigate this progress through what we call the culture war. And so, in my opinion, if it went to assemblies, like if I was a Republican strategist, maybe our only recourse at that point would be to lean even harder into the culture war and try to divide the citizens who get picked on those assemblies. And if you combine that with what you said about, you know, the attention economy, algorithms, hate, like all of this seems like it would lead to a terrible sort of approach. What do you think about how they would respond? And like, could you constrain that response by making sure that the assemblies stick to specific subjects like you've mentioned before? But just generally, how would you forecast the Republican response?
Yeah, so I do think the response would be to focus on issues where, you know, they do best. That might be social issues, but there still is a 38 state obligation before anything gets through. So you might have a lot of division on social issues, but you don't have 3/4 of the country or 3/4 of the states in that sense supporting it. So I'm not sure it really pays. But yes, you can constrain them to particular issues. You can say that the convention is going to consider this issue and we're going to have deliberations around it. You, of course, need to worry about the extent to which you are, which the citizen assemblies are being influenced. Just like juries can be protected, you might imagine for certain issues protecting the citizen assembly. But it's important to recognize that the reason why this hacking works in our current system is that we don't actually have representative participation in the current system. In the current system, we're not Australia where we require everybody to vote. So the people who vote in primaries tend to be the most extreme in each party. the people who are most visible on, social media platforms are the most extreme in these parties. There's no doubt that the extremists would be represented in a representative body, but they would be at the extremes. There would be a large number of people who are not actually at the extremes, as polling shows people are not, for many of the issues that we imagine would be here. So I don't think that I don't mean to suggest that this is, something that kind of just describe it and it's easy to imagine it happening. There's a lot of design detail that needs to go into assuring that the process is fair and persuasive. And one of the most important parts of that is, how do you decide what the Citizen Assembly considers? Jim Fishkin has spent 30 years crafting procedures to make sure that deliberative polls have a fair presenting of the sides that are supposed to be deliberated on. That type of teaching will be essential here too. All I'm saying is that if you are really guaranteeing a large representative sample, you're going to mute the ability of the extremism to have its place. And that would be better than the current political system we've got now.
Jim?
Well, I mean, this is a very disturbing presentation. And as someone who's fancies that he sort of follows events in this country pretty closely, this is kind of the first time I've had a call to be concerned about this convention issue. Why hasn't it received more attention? And where does it exactly stand now? Who's organizing around this to make sure that the procedures you're talking about are installed? I mean, the thing about the lifeboat analogy is interesting. The Titanic only had 20 lifeboats, and it was designed for 1,178 people, and there were 2,400 people who were on the boat. So I think we need to design these lifeboats a lot more aggressively than you've been doing.
Yeah. So I mean,
why have you been so silent?
I haven't been silent. People just haven't been
silent majoritarian. Is that the game you're playing?
No. I mean, the first three, the Titanic, the reason they didn't have enough lifeboats is they expected ships would be able to get to them if there was actually an urgency. And of course, if certain ships didn't ignore the pleas, they would have gotten to them. So it would have worked, but obviously it didn't. Here's where we are. And so the first is the balanced budget one, which has 27 states supporting it. And remember, there's about 4 plenary calls that have not been rejected. So there are 4 that gets added to that to get you to 31. The Convention of the States project is a very strong right-wing anti-federal government project led by a former founder of the Tea Party movement, Mark Meckler. So like one of their amendments is balanced budget, but another is basically to shrink the power of the federal government. It would be a drastic set of amendments. But again, I think there's zero chance they could pass. But they've been working very hard to pass that. The term limits movement has also been quite active. And the bottom one there is the Anti-Citizens United Free and Fair Elections Amendment. Okay, what's depressing about that number 3 is that number was actually, I think, at its highest 7. And Common Cause has made it their cause to go get every legislature that called for a Citizens United amendment to repeal their call. Because Common Cause is constitutionally committed to ending Citizens United, to blocking a convention. And in my view, that is strategically extremely stupid if there's going to be a convention. Yeah. Because if there's going to be a convention and you've basically disqualified the issues you care about, then the convention is guaranteed to be a right-wing convention. And if you really think you can't control it, then it's even more dangerous that you can't control it. If you look at the rules, I mean, these convention movement people have actually been running mock conventions regularly. They recruit thousands of state legislators to come to meet to draft rules for this convention. And if you look at the most prominent set of rules, they're quite strict in, first of all, saying the only proposals that can be considered are proposals that have been supported by 30, I think it's 36 states. And that the provision that says those are the only ones that can be considered is itself not an amendable provision. So this is to say that if there's going to be a convention and you can't have an issue considered unless 36 states have called for it, that by definition means that none of the liberal issues that Common Cause would otherwise support are going to be in that convention. And again, most people just say there's not going to be a convention. That's why you don't see it talked about much. But people like Scott Walker, former governor of Wisconsin, who's become a very active convention person. Ron DeSantis is as well. Scott Walker thinks if you add up all the calls that have actually been ratified, we already have enough to call a convention, which is to say, they believe that if the Republicans take control of Congress, they can just convene a convention. They think they have the legal authority to do it. And then the question is, would the court step in and do anything about it? And I think the answer to that is no. The court would never step in and do anything about it. So this is why part of the reason I'm writing and talking about this is just to scare people like you, right? Because we need more people to realize this is on the table and likely to happen if we get back to another right-wing government. And so what are we doing in response? What's our best defense in response?
To this, obviously, like your idea rests on a citizens' assembly that is deliberative and rational acting in a world in which you describe disinformation and like the continual ability for tech companies in the media environment to polarize and warp senses of information. How does a citizens' assembly address that? Yeah,
so this is why seeing these assemblies function is so important. And they are exploding across Europe right now. So France, Macron had a climate change assembly that met for over the course of, I think it was 7 months or 9 months, every weekend or once a month they would get together and meet. Belgium now has them as a regular part of government. Berlin is now introducing them. And I think when you see them actually function, you realize that the dynamic of sitting face to face and talking about things is enough of a balance to stuff that's going on the outside. Like when you see that the other side is not a bunch of lizards, and you understand, what we're all talking about, we can actually do democratic work in that context if we're relatively protected from that stuff on the outside. And again, the way it's structured is you bring people in, you shut off their phones, you are just deliberating. And if you begin to, what I'm hoping for is we stand these processes up, people can see them enough and notice that they're coming up with solutions that are kind of sensible solutions. And then you compare what they're coming up with, not just in the constitutional context, like we're trying to get Boston to set one up right now to deal with certain local issues. If you see that the assembly is coming up with solutions that are more sensible than what the legislature is doing, which is not hard given how terrible legislatures typically are, people begin to reorient what they think is a more sensible way to decide at least certain kinds of issues. So I would say pick issues that the legislature just is, for some constitutional reason, not able to deal with. So in Ireland, gay marriage and abortion. In America, anything affecting money in politics, right? Is just not capable of dealing with it. Pick those issues, let the assembly decide them, and then see whether you like what the assembly has done versus what the legislature does.
You have made me scared. You have succeeded in making me scared about the prospect of the right constitution. But there's this, more rational side of me that's saying, we should allow people to decide what they want in a more democratic way through, conventions to address issues that would never be addressed by legislatures. But there's also a sort of more realistic, whatever you put it, way, side of me that's saying, maybe we should just invest in more resources, maybe like the Democratic Party
and the liberals should just invest in more resources to stop that convention from happening in the first place. How do you address people who are very like liberals in the cities, very like, you know, stereotypically? How do you like address those fears that that the convention is going to?
I think it depends on how essential you think constitutional reform is. So I with Cenk Uygur, who ran the Wolfpack Anti-Citizens United movement, and now is a not qualified candidate for president. He runs TYT Networks. Cenk and I met with Robert Reich in June of 2016. And we're trying to persuade him, first of all, to understand the facts, so he doesn't say things that are not true, and maybe to even support the idea of a convention. And after a long lunch, he said, Reich said, okay, but I'm still not convinced it's worth the risk. Because he said, Clinton will be elected and she will appoint 3 Supreme Court justices and we'll get everything we need out of the Supreme Court. Okay, well, now that that's been taken off the table, we've got to go back and ask the question, are there things we need? Are there amendments that we need to be able to run a functioning democracy? And my view is there are really fundamental things that we've got to fix in this democracy constitutionally. The money in politics one is fundamental, the right to vote. We have no right to vote in America, which means that all sorts of burdens are constitutional because it's not structured as a fundamental right. The gerrymandering, all the ways, and the overturned table things, many of them we could fix and need to fix constitutionally. And I don't think we get any serious problem addressed sensibly until we solve at least some of them, like the money in politics one. So if you think amendment is really essential, and you realize Congress is not going to do it, I think investing money to stop the convention movement is just self-defeating. Like, okay, we've stopped the convention movement and also sunk the ship. Now what do we do? So just to finish your point, between the alternative of like figuring a safer way to do it and just letting it go the way it is right now, I do think there's legitimate reasons to be fearful about the way it's run right now, because the basic people who run it are state legislators. And state legislators, despite our kind of naive sense that state legislatures are the most democratic institution, they are the least democratic. They are the most minoritarian institutions within our democracy because of gerrymandering. Again, the Wisconsin example is replicated in many states across the country. Sorry.
I'm just wondering, is there any chance that any good amendment is going to pass this hurdle of getting 38 ratifications?
I think the money in politics amendment absolutely.
Yeah, I'd like to follow. I mean, isn't that the single most popular progressive alternative to the budget stuff? I mean, we all got behind fix the money in politics.
Yes.
I mean, what's the evidence for the popularity of campaign finance reform?
Oh, there's like repeated polling. I'm involved in a process to stand up. This is a footnote, but I actually think the Supreme Court is going to allow limitations on contributions to super PACs. It's an issue the court has never addressed. And the lower court made an obvious mistake. Larry Tribe and Al Schuler have just been circulating this point. So we're trying to stand up an initiative in Maine to attack super PACs. The polling there is like 80%.
Wow.
Support it. And so you're right. The one the right thinks everybody loves is the balanced budget one. But balanced budget is a sort of issue that I think that when people start paying attention to it, the support in the red states will begin to collapse. Like if you begin to say to the red states, look, you guys are welfare states. Like Kentucky,
Louisiana.
Yeah, Louisiana, California, Kentucky, New York and California are subsidizing you.
Absolutely.
If you start having a balanced budget amendment, fine, we'll just pull back the subsidy. Like you guys will starve. So I don't think that process will actually produce a balanced budget amendment. But I do think that that process, at least it's a democratic part to it, would produce a money in politics. I mean, it would be a big fight, but I'm optimistic about it. I think
the process to get Massachusetts to, in the citizen level, organizing as a predicate for, you know, for the progressive side of this? Are you starting at the state level?
There's a great organization called American Promise that
Okay.
has been working at the state level. They have like 22 states now that have passed referenda calling on Congress to propose an amendment to deal with the money in politics issue.
Wow.
Now, I think that the problem with that strategy is that referenda that call on Congress to do something have no legal force. So who cares? I think it would have been better if they would have gotten calls for a convention in there somewhere. But anyway, that's been their strategy. But they've been building this grassroots movement to make salient what is just true whenever you poll it, that overwhelmingly people hate the money and the politics stuff. There was a great leaked audio where these Republican consultants were speaking to the Republican Senate committee, and they were talking about money and politics issue. And the consultants basically said, you guys cannot win arguing that there ought to be no limits on money. You can't win that. Even with your base, you can't win that. So stop trying to win that argument. Like, there could be technical ways in which you stop it, technical ways in which you argue it's not going to be, but never take it on head on, because this is just as fundamental and widespread as anything could be.
Wow, I love it.
Alex, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I'm curious. You and Robert Reich seem to disagree fundamentally. It seems like you think we can win the race towards this threat of conventions, while he thinks like it's so threatening that we need to shut down the concept whatsoever. Who do you think like the big players could be moving forward in this? Like, for instance, maybe DeSantis, his image of I'm the policy guy who gets stuff done, when he loses this primary, he'll shift over to this convention idea and make it, maybe he's the person that Robert Reich didn't see coming with Trump in 2016 to pivot into this convention idea. Like, and then Shank is off running for president and saying Biden's gonna lose. Like, who could be the players? Right now it seems like a vacuum.
I think, again, it requires everybody recognizing that a convention is coming. And we're not there yet. But two more states, we're going to be there. Because at 2 more states, there's going to be a real argument whether we're already there or not. And the strategy of common cause to say, let's stop it, will have clearly failed. So then we're going to shift into, now that there's going to be a convention, what's the right strategy? And again, I think the 2 strategies are, we didn't stop the convention, but we could preemptively block anything it tried to do. Let's work on that. And what I'm trying to set the predicate for is something more ambitious, because I think we absolutely need amendments. We can't run a constitution that can't be amended, right? It's like, you can't have a ship that can't be steered. We can't have a constitution that can't be amended. And that's what we have right now. And that's not going to change. Like American Promise, I'm on their advisory board. They've been doing this for a decade. They will be doing it. Their plan is to be doing it for another decade. But they reject the convention idea because among leftists, it's too controversial. They want it passed through Congress. And the leader, Jeff Clement, and I are friends. And when I told him about our strategy to try to get the court to undo super PACs, he said, well, I support you, but I don't think that you're going to succeed in getting 5 votes. And I said to him, well, I support you in getting an amendment, but you've had 10 years. How many Republicans do you have in the United States Senate who say they would support an anti-money amendment after 10 years of work? And the answer is 0. And you're going to need at least 16, right? You're going to need 16, or maybe more, depending on what happens to the Democrats in the Senate. So that's just to say it's not going to happen that way. It's just not going to happen that way. And so either you accept we're not going to get amendments, or you say let's figure another way to get them. I think we've got to figure another way to get them. David, you have a question?
Hey, thank you so much. So my question is, understood on the discussion around, campaign finance reform and passing new laws. When we think about this topic in a broader way, would you also propose changes to how the system of special interests and lobbying is organized in the United States? I do have some memories of hearing a political scientist talk about why, for example, France's system of appointing people to do lobbying is in some ways better than ours because the US is so dominated by moneyed interests and its lobbying that it tends to crowd out less moneyed interests. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts on what the interplay is between the campaign finance and then the lobbying.
I think they're very directly connected. Basically, we've created a system where representatives are starved for resources. They're starved for both informational resources, because we've shut down a whole bunch of support that Congress used to have for like writing bills and doing studies and things like that. And they're constrained for financial resources. And that's a perfect system for making them dependent on lobbyists, because the lobbyists come in and they both have all the information that they want. Like they've got the polls, they've got the bill, they've got all the arguments they need for whatever they care about. And they also walk in and they are the mechanism through which money is raised. I mean, they themselves can't give more than the maximum amount, but they will routinely run press conferences and, fundraising events as just the ordinary way in which they deal. There's this venture capitalist who has this amazing talk about how they had some idea, they wanted to talk to their representative about it. The representative said, yeah, I'll come out and we'll talk about it. And so they were excited. He was going to come talk about it. And then the staffer called and said, we'd like to organize a breakfast while he's there. Maybe you can invite some of your friends. And so he invited 4 of the friends. And then they said, well, so they're going to need to be giving the maximum amount they can give. And I think that was like $20,000 each. And then it was basically the congressperson's office required that they have a fundraiser that was going to raise $250,000 in exchange for him showing up talking about whether he'd support the bill or not. And so the point is the lobbyists are the great channel through which this is done. And if that's true, then the only way we break the distorting power of lobbyists is to break that dependence. So there are 2 ways to do that. One is
Larry Lessig.
One is to increase the power of Congress to do its own work, like build infrastructure so it doesn't depend on lobbyists to know what the way the world is. And the second is to change the way we fund campaigns. So I support, vouchers as a way of funding campaigns. There are matching grant systems, but whatever the system is, you need to make it so they're not dependent on the lobbyists to raise the money they need to get elected. And if you can remove that dependence, then they would be free to make decisions based on what's right or what's wrong, or what's in the interest of their constituents or not, and not on the depend on what the interest of the lobbyist is. But I do agree, the lobbyist is the lever through which this power is now exercised.
Well,
thank you. My question is a little more broad, but I'm curious as to what you think the role of globalization and I guess just increased immigration, more people becoming part of the US citizen population. Do you think that's something that would play a role in, I guess, something like this succeeding, where I think earlier you talked about Denmark having, selecting samples of their population, random people from their population to vote on laws before they're passed. Do you see that as, do you see any concerns with globalization in this process, or is that something that would be helpful? Is that something that's irrelevant?
Well, there's one dimension to globalization which is obviously and directly relevant, and that is that global capital is enormously consequential inside of our political system, even though theoretically foreign capital should have no influence. But when you're talking about global corporations, there's no way to really say what is the American part of this global corporation. So I think like dealing with the money issue would be an important way to deal with that problem first. But as to the people who are actually coming in, that's a great point. There's nothing to say that a citizen assembly can only be citizens. And indeed, certain localities are extending the right to vote beyond citizens. You can imagine saying, we want the citizen assembly to reflect everybody within our community. So that means legal immigrants as well as citizens could be included as well. And I think that would make a lot of sense, although I'm not sure quite how the politics plays out, because obviously this is the cheapest device to deploy in politics to rally people both for and against you. So I'm not sure how that actually develops. It is interesting that in the context of Citizens United, which said that as long as a corporation spends its money independently of a campaign, it can spend as much money as it wants. Then very soon after that, the Supreme Court had to address a question of whether legal immigrants were allowed to spend their money to support or oppose a candidate as long as it was independent of the candidate. And their argument was, if a corporation can do it, why shouldn't we be able to do it? Indeed, Justice Scalia, in his concurrence in that case, said, the issue actually has nothing to do with a corporation being a person. It's just that Congress has no power to restrict speech. So if a corporation speaks, Congress has no power to silence it. Well, under that reasoning, so too, if a legal immigrant speaks or spends their money speaking, there should be no power to constrain it. But the DC Circuit, Judge Kavanaugh writing the opinion, and then the Supreme Court affirmed it unanimously, just summarily, said that yes, you're allowed to exclude legal immigrants from spending money, even if you can't exclude corporations from spending money, because the conception of democracy is that it's for us, it's for citizens, and that line is fundamental. So apparently it's for citizens and corporations, but not for legal immigrants. And that's a way of being kind of pessimistic of whether that immigrants or people emigrating to the United States would be included in that public.
US corporation.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Thomas, can I ask a question?
Yeah, I just called on you.
Okay. Professor Lessig, as a constitutional scholar, I wonder as to how we are in a very strange situation right now where potentially the country could be in two wars, and the power to wage wars and the power of control on foreign policy is almost completely delegated to the executive branch, and the legislative and the general public is not really involved in those decision-making, in that decision-making process. I wonder what the founding fathers were thinking to allow this kind of scenario to come about if the current scenario plays out as it is, with war in Eastern Europe, war in the Middle East, all being handled by the executive branch, in spite of the War Powers Act, which is being ignored, does it not place our country in some kind of peril to have allowed this extreme situation to develop, which was certainly not perhaps the intention of the founding fathers? As a scholar of the constitutional law and history, I wonder how this has come about, and if anything can be done to control or to reverse this situation as it exists today.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly the case that the framers expected Congress would play the primary role in deciding whether to go to war or not, even though necessity would require the president have the ability to deploy troops to deal with an emergency or an invasion or something like that. So there was always some balance, but the presumption was basically be Congress. But this is yet another example of how the framers were very naive politicians, because the institutional incentive of Congress is to hide from that decision, and to leave and to allow it to be made basically by the president. And if the president gets it right, Congress can rally with the president. If the president gets it wrong, then Congress can stand back from the president. And that is even more true when you add parties into Congress, which of course the framers never imagined. We're not crafting the system to imagine parties. Now, the War Powers Act was a pretty bold effort to try to reclaim to Congress control. Every president, Republican and Democrat, since the War Powers Act has denied its constitutionality in the sense of like they believe the president still has a constitutional authority to override it. And so that's an issue that's not been settled by the court, whether Congress can reclaim it like that. But the practical reality is Congress does have a pretty powerful control over what we do in both Ukraine and in Israel. I mean, Ukraine is terrified right now that the Republicans in the House will never allow a Ukraine funding bill to pass Congress. And so there it is, Congress exercising absolute control over whether we fund war efforts in Ukraine. Obviously, Israel, there's not going to be any political issue about whether we fund things with Israel, but the people who support supporting the Ukrainians want to tie the two together so that if we support one, we support both. And that's probably not problematic because, of course, we don't have troops on the ground. We're not actually waging war. We haven't waged war against these countries. We've just supported others waging war. And that ability to support others waging war has been a part of foreign policy since the beginning. And as long as the president can get it paid for, it's within the scope of what the president has traditionally exercised as his power. However, obviously, my own view is the worst feature of American constitutionalism is that it has allowed Empire America to develop. And the idea of America as the fighting force for the world is now taken for granted among both parties. And that is absolutely the worst feature of like American constitutionalism. So I don't like any of this reality. I just think it is reality.
I've got one more question about the strategy of the 13 states. I'm trying to wrap my head around it. And I ask you to engage in this thought experiment. Suppose that we had a really partisan Supreme Court that understands your strategy and wants to do their best to frustrate it and wants to get right-wing content out of this convention and prevent any kind of leftist content from coming out of it. How would such a Supreme Court act? How could they use their powers to frustrate what you're trying to do?
Well, I mean, it would be hard to get, given their jurisdictional barriers, like standing and real case and controversy, it would be hard for them to be able to review the question in advance. But the way to blow it up is for them to somehow be able to declare there's no such thing as a preemptive rejection. Or even if there's a preemptive rejection, there's perpetual ability to change your mind and then ratify it once, later on, which probably is true, but politically is quite costly. I don't deny that they could bend in an extreme way to block something like this. I don't think they have the institutional ability to do it anymore. I think they are so weakened as an institution. And they are keen not to take on issues that are going to weaken them even more. This would be quite extreme.
I've been through all the money scandals.
The money scandals, the abortion case, like the march of right-wing cases brought about by these, judges who were appointed in very problematic ways. The game that Mitch McConnell played to deny Barack Obama an appointment and to rush through Donald Trump appointments. I just think the whole thing smells. People have the sense of it. And, the consequence of that is that the Supreme Court has the lowest favorability that it's had. We didn't have polling at the nadir of the conservative court that was fighting against. We didn't have polling before that, but in modern history, it's as worse it's been. And at the center, Chief Justice Roberts is a deep institutionalist. He's very concerned to figure out how do you build back some of the trust. So I think we're in a period where they're going to try to not seem partisan in an extreme way. And, so that's why I'm optimistic about, the super PAC law. I think they will do the right thing according to their own principles in that case for exactly this reason.
Like that somebody could bring a case which would challenge the constitutionality maybe, or the legitimacy of that advance agreement by the 13.
Hard to see how you get standing to do it. Because typically you can't get into the courts unless you have a personal conflict. So the legislators can't sue, like the other party can't sue. Or more precisely, they would have to make a pretty dramatic exception to the ordinary rules of standing and ripeness and in order to be able to address those questions.
So you don't see that as a real danger?
I don't say it's not a danger, I just don't think it's a significant danger. Or it's worth it risking that danger given the high cost of doing nothing.
Right. But in the end, I mean, if the preemptive thing isn't valid, then in the end, your 13 states have to just block it.
Yeah.
If anything bad comes out, they just have to block it.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts, comments from?
Is there any concern that this sort of mechanism of states agreeing to kind of do this together would raise an interstate compact constitutional issues? And if so, like, what's the response to that?
So the compact is basically understood as limiting the states doing something the states don't have a constitutional authority to do. And they certainly have a constitutional authority to decide whether to ratify amendments or not. So the fact that they would agree to ratify in a patterned way or to reject in a patterned way couldn't raise a compact issue. Now, maybe it would if you tried to enforce it. Like imagine 13 states said, this is what we're going to do, and then one state defected. It's probably not enforceable. So you're relying on the political incentives, not on legal force to get them to follow through. Yeah.
So far, we focused a lot on the blue states, but how about the red states? From what you know or so, do you think some of them might be ready or keen on maybe adopting the same sort of legislation you propose, or you think all the red states might be against it?
Well, if the blue states were talking about repealing the Second Amendment, yeah, they would look for anything they can to block that. But again, the blue states are pushing things that are actually not red and blue. So the state of Montana, really solidly red state, had one of these American Promise initiatives on their ballot to call on Congress to basically overturn Citizens United. It won by 78% in Montana. So it would be hard to imagine red states like rallying to stop the money in politics thing. And I think that's the only thing blue states are pushing, right? As much as, we would love to think about a lot of other things, I think nobody, given the basic makeup of the United States is having all these red states, there's not much that people would think we could do, except things that were generally cross-partisan, and this would be a generally cross-partisan one. Issues like term limits are, I think, politically ambiguous. I think there are many people on the left who also would like the idea of term limits. When we see the gerontocracy that runs the United States, there are a lot of people who are eager to imagine changing that. So that might, I'm not sure whether that is red or blue, but there too, I don't think you would have the kind of movement to stop it that we have, that has developed given the fears about what the right would do if the right had a control of the convention. That's sort of things that Bob Reich was talking about.
It seems like there might be an opportunity to stop it before it gets to the point of no citizen assemblies, right? Because if I'm understanding you correctly, you still need state legislatures to agree to enact legislation that would kind of create these assemblies? And, what's the process for getting 38 states to agree to do that? When you have such a profound capture of state legislators, by Republicans across the
Yeah, so to fill out the timing of it, what we want to happen right now, before the convention is real, independent of the convention, is to set up citizen assemblies about amendments. So imagine those puttering along for a couple of years. Then a convention is ripe to be called because 34 states have called for it. The state legislatures then need to pass laws to figure out how they're going to select delegates and how, it depends on how it's ratified. It can either be ratified by state legislatures or ratified by state conventions. Only one amendment has ever been ratified by state conventions. That was the 21st Amendment that repealed prohibition. It's extremely quick, like 6 months after the amendment was proposed, it was ratified because people wanted to drink again. And in that context, there was a very important democratic check because more than half of the states said that if you were elected as a delegate to one of those conventions, you had to vote the way you pledged. So you would say, I'm either wet or I'm dry. And if you were elected on that, you weren't allowed to vote anyway, contrary to that. So the point is that the process of convening the convention will require legislation. And the idea is to insert this within the legislation. Now, why would the 38 states want to comply with that? Because if you've lined up the 13 states to say, we're going to reject anything that comes out of the convention, unless you've got a democratic check in it, the cheaper thing to do is to build a democratic check into it. And maybe it would be something like an assembly. People have been convinced assemblies were cool things, then maybe a lot of states would do it. But it could just be a cheaper thing, which is like referenda, like we will, or even, I don't want to be too strict about what a democratic check is, even though I think polling is a terrible democratic check. It would be better than, just the legislatures. So it's saying you've got to add a democratic check. If you've added it in and we've got a convention that has democratic check in it, then we'll vote in the normal way on it. But otherwise, it's dead on arrival.
Jim?
Larry, this course is, to some extent focused on global issues, and the global state of democracy is a topic that we're addressing next Tuesday. I wanted you to put your comparative hat on and see along all these different dimensions of gerrymandering, campaign finance, the voter suppression. How do we stack up? Are we no longer in the top 10 of democracies? Is there an easy way of summarizing that, or is this just too complicated a sort of a bundle to sort of to understand how we stack up and what the trends are?
Many organizations that rate democracies have rated America as having a very weak democracy right now. So we've gone down dramatically in all of the ratings. But I think a more important point to recognize is democracy itself is doing badly almost everywhere in the world. Scandinavian countries have an easier, easier challenge. So they're doing okay with democracy, but basically everywhere else, people have become convinced that though democracy was supposed to represent the people, it represents the elite. And so I think there's a general question about how do we revive faith in democracy.
Right.
And that's why I think these innovations are so important. I think, citizen assemblies are not an American idea. They are being spread everywhere. Japan turns out to have overwhelmingly large number of citizen assemblies. I actually can show you the statistics of these pretty easily. I think, where was this? Yeah, right here. So, oh, I'm not showing it anymore. Share screen. Okay, I'm not the host anymore. You demoted me. That's really depressing. Okay. Okay, so this was a colleague's. So here's the number of wait, so this is yeah, so this is the number of citizen assemblies across the OECD countries.
Share the screen.
Oh, it's not shared? Oh, sorry. I had clicked on it,
Green
shared.
button at the bottom.
Yeah, share screen. Okay, it says shared, and now.
There it is. Yeah, we got it.
All right. So here's OECD countries, the number of citizen assemblies, and here's where they're actually happening. So bizarrely, Japan is like way out ahead of everybody, 167. Germany, Australia, Canada, UK, Austria, Denmark, the OECD like numbers right below the United States. And so I really think that these kind of innovations to build democratic structures that are more persuasively democratic are going to be critical steps towards reviving democracy globally. And it's going to come from the local level because it's, you know, that's where these things are actually manifesting themselves. But, you know, I think that, you know, you look at Britain, there's the same kind of what I was describing as AI control over elections in Britain that produced these results that have been deeply problematic there, that I think is going to motivate this kind of innovation as well. You know, I think that from the money perspective, I think that you know, the nature of money corruption is very local. And it's different, dramatically different cross country, even though we would say that there's corruption, there is a form of corruption in democracy across most of these major countries. It's just the way it works is different. So the way the elite has its influence in France is different from how it has its influence in the United States, and Asia, same point. And it's that corruption that I think is like motivating the public's attitude that democracy is not worth fighting for, like, because what are we really getting from it? And you know, people like Parag Khanna have like very aggressively argued that if you take nations and divide them between those that are focused on governing and those that are focused on democracy, those that are focused on governing tend to be doing much better for their people than those that are focused on democracy. And that's, I think, the source of this kind of sense, which is, you know, for people our age, unimaginable, that people would say, yeah, maybe democracy just isn't the thing. I think that's increasingly a view that is real across the world, and especially for younger people.
Oh,
Ouch.
Asking yet another broad question, but I'm curious if, you know, let's say everything in the US does work out and, you know, the convention works out to everybody's favor and democracy is restored, or maybe not even democracy, but governance is, you know, it's just something that works out for everybody. What do you expect that to look like in its impact for the rest of the world? Do you think that, you know, the US does obviously have an influence, a lot of influence on just globally? Do you see that, do you see a change like this in the US influencing other countries to change their governance?
Well, I mean, the first change it would have is that the externalities the United States imposes on the rest of the world, I think, would be reduced. You know, so the military industrial externality is the most obvious. You know, we spend unbelievable amounts of money on defense, quote defense, which has nothing to do with defense. And a more rational system wouldn't do that. And so to the extent we pull back from our hundreds of bases around the world to be less focused on being the global police force and more focused on dealing with the problems that are American problems, that would have a consequence for the rest of the world. And a good one. I also think that, you know, to the extent we're not blocked on dealing with climate change in a really aggressively appropriate way, that too would benefit the rest of the world, because we're obviously externalizing the cost of carbon in a way that makes no sense for us or for the world. Would it inspire other democracies? Let's hope so. You know, America told itself it inspired the democratic movements around the world at the founding, and that was true because ours was the most radical experiment with the idea of self-governing. But I think that we're now seeing innovations that are like everywhere, and I think that if we can demonstrate how a country as big as ours can incorporate them in our democratic process, that would be that would be inspirational everywhere. But you know, that feels a long time away.
Right, I think we're at the end of our time, and thank you all for participating.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank
It was
you
really fun.
especially for Larry for this super interesting.
Great. Thank you.